Good evening. I'm Dan Finn, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, who is officially Associate Pastor of St. Ignatius Church in San Francisco. Our speaker is retired from academic life. He has taught at Loyola Marymount University, where he was the Casasa Professor in Social Values. He's spent most of his career at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. But he's also taught in Ireland, Belgium, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Australia, and Minnesota in the past. He's authored or edited 19 books, including Christian Political Ethics, Globalization and Catholic Social Thought, Religion and Nationalism, and An American Strategic Theology. Though perhaps one of the most interesting parts of his bio is also a bit idiosyncratic. He is a board member of the California Interfaith Power and Light Company. So after the talk, you can ask him what a religious electric company is all about. In any case, please join me in welcoming Father John Coleman.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to talk about a chapter in a book that I wrote, and there was a conference a little over a year ago in Leuven, and you'll see this wonderful picture. Students should love that. It's called the Librecha, and if you look carefully, the book, if you're there, the book's upside down that he's reading, and you'll see the cup of beer that is being poured into his head. And right next to it is the lovely 15th century town hall, but behind it is the marketplace where students drink till 3 to 5 in the morning. So it's not only here. And it's a place where the Jesuits were. Now, the lowlands aren't called the lowlands for nothing, because it's pretty flat. But the only Baroque church, there's some lovely, lovely Gothic churches from the 13th century. The only Baroque church is at the highest point in Louvain. Leave it to the Jesuits to have gotten that church. But Robert Bellarmine taught there. Now, the key to our theme was that social movements, not what the bishops are saying or papal encyclicals, but Catholic social movements for justice and peace are crucial to Catholic social teaching. And it often predates it. I mean, often when the popes wrote their encyclical, they came down as if they were from heaven. And you don't realize that had there not been pilgrimages of working class people from France going to Leo XIII, had you not had people from Switzerland at the University of Freiburg demanding that he speak to the labor question, it would never have happened. And similarly, in later encyclicals, there are things that the popes just refer to. Well, it came out of long, heated debates in the Semaine Sociale in France or in the Catholicische in Germany, where local people who were members of unions and Catholic social groups were involved. So the key text which tells that story is a book by Marvin Mitch called Catholic Social Teaching and Movements. And we'll see it's important sociologically and for other reasons to pay attention to this. Another text where I have a chapter in is a book called Modern Catholic Social Teaching, edited by Kenneth Himes. And my chapter is on the future of Catholic social teaching, but much of it tries to give the story of Catholic social teaching from below, in the movements. Not just in encyclicals or episcopal teaching. Because if those are any good, it's because they learned something from the ground, and then finally they said something about it. Catholic social thought has always depended on movements. In Europe and Latin America, there still are in some places, explicit Catholic parties. For years in Belgium and in Holland, you wouldn't get a government without the Catholic Party as being part of it, and labor unions. There were young Christian workers, young Christian students, the Christian family movement, which gave us that important image about Catholic social teaching: see, judge, act. And you don't always get that from papal encyclicals. See. See with the eyes, even of using social science and economics and sociology. See what's really happening. What are the signs of the times? What's new? You'll notice it took a while for the church to do that in social teaching, but at a certain point, you begin to say, well, it's the 20th anniversary of Quadragesimo Anno, we're writing something else. Why are we writing something else? Because there's something new. Here are the new things that are happening. See, judge in the light of the Gospels, but you can't see except through social science. And then act. Too often, only social movements can act. I mean, the Vatican isn't going to act. And now Rome is always a bit suspicious of pluralism and localism, but to some extent, when you see and you judge and you act, it's got to be in real locales. And what's true in Peru may not be true in Belgium or vice versa. And you have to be careful of universalizing it. So as you may know, at one point, the papacy said that Catholics should only belong to Catholic unions. Now that worked in Germany, and it worked in Belgium, and it worked in the Netherlands. But the British and the Americans were horrified because if you had Catholic unions, they would be absolutely ineffective. They had to be joined with others. So pluralism and localism are necessary to really see, judge, and act. Now, at our conference, we looked at 5 different kinds of movements, classic and international. So there are, first of all, classic and international groups like Caritas International. This is really the international group of Catholic charities that does refugee work and does work in development in Africa. Pax Christi, founded in 1945, an international group around the world, and various justice and peace commissions. So that's one kind of group. The Catholic, classic, and international groups. And some of them are very effective. So the Caritas International in Britain, CAFAD, is very effective. It has a great deal of influence. Second were religious orders movements. Sheila was saying that she can get into Catholic social teaching by connecting it with the Benedictine charism. So you have third orders of Franciscans and Dominicans, and the Jesuits have various social action groups and talk about the faith that does justice, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Jesuit refugee service. Then there are new movements of spirituality that have emerged over the last 40 or 50 years. Comunione et Liberazione in Italy, which has a kind of a progressive, slightly socialist move toward it, although it's a Catholic movement. Focolare, which is a very important movement, and again, social movements and papal encyclicals. You can't really understand Benedict's really only social encyclical and his best, Caritas in Veritate, if you don't know about Focolare, because part of the whole thing of the logic of gift and corporations that are not simply in the business for only making profit, but who distribute it with charity and so forth, comes out of Focolare. The new catechumenate, and I can't stress enough the importance and wonder of the community of San Egidio, founded by lay people in Rome, in an area named San Egidio, but it's now found in Chicago and several other places. You may know or not know that toward the end of President Bush's administration, Bush went to Rome to meet the Pope, and his foreign policy people wanted to talk to the people of the community of San Egidio. Now, this community is a spiritual community, a community of prayer, but it intervened to stop a civil war in Algiers. It's done that sort of thing. Its diplomatic efforts have been extraordinary for peace. So the Bush people came and said, teach us. How can we do this? And they said, you don't have a chance. Because when we go, people know that we don't represent some other special interest. We simply represent the common good. Who's going to believe that of your government? So go away, that you have nothing to learn from us. And then there are direct service communities, which often are more about charity. One thinks of the classic St. Vincent de Paul Society. And they often don't do a lot of social analysis, but they do charity and outreach. And think of L'Arche. Again, I'm mentioning not only old ones, because L'Arche, after all, the founder is still alive. I don't know what that is. That got in there somehow. Okay. So there continue to be radical Christian movements, mainly in the developing countries. So at this conference, we heard talks about the movements for the rights of undocumented people, movements serving or working for refugees, working for the undeserved urban poor, a very important thing in a country that's not terribly Catholic, but where this has had deep influence beyond the Catholic Church, and in Indonesian farmers' cooperatives, in AIDS network, in issues for Amazon Indian protection, and of course many of you know about Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. Once again, how movements affect the official Catholic social teaching. Okay, we're soon going to celebrating the 50th anniversary of Vatican II, and of course the great social teaching of Vatican II was the church in the modern world, the new signs of the times, see, judge, and act. But a big thing was, for the first time in Catholic social teaching, some worry about war, and a clear statement that not only is it permissible, but it may be a wonderful vocation to be a pacifist. Well, that didn't come from the sky. Dorothy Day and Pax Christi were there lobbying the bishops like mad because they had the experience of that. It wasn't just an abstract thing. Okay, so social movements and teaching. And then a final kind of group are Christians active in secular social movements in a big way. You probably don't know this, but Amnesty International was founded by only Catholics. And then it spread. It became the kind of group that it was. But it grew out of Catholic motivation. Doctors Without Borders, that's not true of that, but lots of Catholic input, in the same way with Greenpeace. So it's important, when we think about movements, to be Roman Catholic is as much a verb as a noun. So what movements give us that you don't get when you just read encyclicals? They give us data. They give us a rootedness of social action in faith. They give us an emotional bonding. They sometimes give us arguments about alternatives. They give us a spirituality that's focused on a given issue, not just free-floating spirituality, but on refugees or on Pax Christi kind of thing. And they move to advocacy. See, judge, act includes advocacy. Now, it's harder for bishops and for the Vatican to get too much into advocacy. They can teach, but it's hard for them to get into advocacy, and partially because of the kind of broader thing that they want to do. But without advocacy, there's not much action, and therefore you have to look to the social movements for that, and some concern for alternative options. So my paper was a sociological look, and I wanted to look at official Catholic social teaching and try to look at where its strengths and weaknesses are sociologically. And what I noticed was, too often in official Catholic social teaching, there's an over-harmonious view of society. Society is a place of concord. Everything goes together. And perhaps ideally it should be that way, but it isn't that way. So one of the problems is official Catholic social teaching from the Pope and the bishops is not much open to a conflict model. Now conflict in and of itself isn't necessarily something that we're going to always say is terrific. But some social change isn't possible without conflict. And social movements are much more open and more learned about issues of conflict and easier to get engaged in it. Secondly, movements are more focused. They give us data. And in my chapter for this book, I studied an important document of the Jesuit Refugee Service on refugees in Europe, country by country, where they did sociological analysis. They went and interviewed refugees in the various countries. And again, you wouldn't get that from a free-floating Episcopal or... Movements can network better. Most of the movements say, well, we know, Pax Christi, we know if we're really working for peace and alternative means of conflict resolution, which is not simply war, but other kinds of things, that this is a hard sell. We can't do it on our own. If you just go off on your own, it's not going to work. We're going to have to network with other groups that are similar, even if we disagree with them on other things. And one of the things, you'll notice one of my books is called Globalization and Catholic Social Thought. One of the things that puzzled me as I used to teach globalization and write about it was that the most global organization in the world, bar none, is absent in the literature, or pretty absent in the literature in globalization. And I wonder, well, why is there nothing about Roman Catholicism in the literature in globalization? Well, you'd think there would be. Well, it could be the secular bias of the sociological writers, but I think it's because the official church isn't good at networking. It's our game. We're gonna, and they're a little bit chary of sharing the glory. Well, movements don't have that luxury. And so if you want to have global impact, you've got to look for something more than what you're going to get from the Vatican or the Bishop's Council. And in some ways, I understand the limits of the Vatican and the Bishop's Councils. It's not that I'm saying, well, they should be directly involved in advocacy. But movements can do that. What also became clear to me was that Catholic social thought has to be much clearer when it talks about structural sin, about the relation of structure and agency. I'm not going to do more on this, but Dan has a book that's coming out that I have a chapter in where that's our whole debate. And again, we're trying to learn from the sociologists. A big thing is movements put together spirituality and liturgy to moral argument. Sometimes when people hear moral arguments from the bishops or the Vatican, it's kind of abstract, universal principle. I don't know the narrative. So what? Where does it enter my story? Well, movements are more likely to connect it with liturgy to moral argument. And for them, Catholic social teaching is not our best kept secret. They know it and they live it. And I saw examples of that. And one powerful example for me is Pax Christi. I was a member of it. And there was a period during the Reagan buildup of nuclear weapons when Pax Christi led Stations of the Cross for 30 miles or whatever to Livermore Lab, and then some of us got arrested. But they would stop at various places, and they would do a Station of the Cross in front of a gun shop in Berkeley, or et cetera. So it's not just moral argument, there's something that, and they're more likely to think about alternative options and advocacy. So in my paper, I was asked explicitly to deal with the ecological question, and I argued for two more changes in Catholic social teaching. Not just stewardship, but a cosmology. Now, we all were taught that we were created in the image of God. Terrific. Don't give that up. Sometimes we were taught or thought that that meant we were created uniquely in the image of God, and therefore we had stewardship over everything else, which really, oh, no, wait a second. All of creation, well, do you think we exhaust the grandeur of God? And which raises some new questions about, the loss of species, etc., which mirror God creation. And then we need to do more, and actually I give credit to Pope Benedict XVI because he's the first one who put squarely in the social teaching about economics, politics, economic development, put squarely in that the issue of the environment. So we have to make ecology central to the economy, because if ecology collapses, so does all of the economy. We often forget that half of the jobs of the world are in fishing, in a world where there's overfishing, farming, in a world of global warming and causing droughts, and forestry, in a world of deforestation. So we need movements to address that. Okay. And I ended, and I'm going to talk about some of the other things. I ended my paper, so I was asked to do case studies. So I did a case study of Jesuit volunteer, of Jesuit refugee service, Pax Christi. And in my paper, I looked at a remarkable study of Green Sisters in the United States. The book is called Green Sisters, and it's a sociological study of 50 different centers of American Catholic nuns. And one of the wonders of American Catholic nuns is as they get 80, they're still alive. But anyway, these people had mother houses out in the country, in farming areas, and so they turned them into ecological centers about issues of the environment and global warming. Now, once again, what you see is a careful connection with spirituality, advocacy. They often turn them into organic farms that then give their produce to the homeless in the nearby city. They have, you and I all know, or did know, those of us of a certain age all knew the Stations of the Cross. Well, they have the Stations of the Earth. They have a kind of Madonna of the Earth, etc. And they built up 50 centers now in the U.S. on spiritual ecology. And the book Green Sisters makes clear to me the thing of the teaching of justice about Catholic social teaching. It's helped if you focus on one issue, if you have a liturgy and a spirituality to go with it, etc. But it's a remarkable sociological studies of the Green Sisters. How older nuns had picked up a new vocation. Now, many of these, however, started with Catholic social teaching and issues of justice. Many of you, some of you of a certain age will know the name Carol Costigan. She was head of Network. This is a group of nuns in Washington, D.C. who lobby on issues of economics and for the poor, etc. And she led Network and helped found one of these Green Sisters centers down in Texas. I think it's near San Antonio, but it's someplace in Texas. So there were other presentations at this conference. Michael Shook, who's a professor at Loyola Chicago, and who has written a very important book on the history of Catholic social teaching, gave some rich examples of movements in history, including the Lithuanian Catholic Federation, which kept alive the idea of an independent Lithuania and had an important role in opposing the Soviet occupation of Lithuania. And as you know, of the three countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that were devastated by Russian rule, Lithuania is the one that's most flourishing now because they were able to keep alive this kind of national idea. He also talked about movements with the Amazon Indians and land registration. And every once in a while it will hit the news when some terrible person will kill a nun who's standing up for the rights. Jose Casanova gave an important presentation, again about social movements. Now, Jose Casanova is a sociologist who teaches at Georgetown, a rather distinguished sociologist. And his thing was on the important third wave of democratization in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, which came from Catholic social movements, but came at a time, we're talking about the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when people had learned that what had worked in Europe in the 1890s and 1880s, namely separate Catholic parties and labor unions, no longer made sense, that it was counterproductive. And in fact, although they started by saying that they embodied this tradition for other reasons, usual demographic and special interest reasons, they began to sell it out. And so that what you got was social movements of democratization that were Catholic, but did not demand Catholic parties. So isn't it interesting? The Polish didn't ask for a Catholic party. The Spaniards getting democratization, Chile and Brazil getting it back. A brilliant, brilliant presentation about the role of social movements. Somebody had asked me today, well, you've got these historic examples, but do you expect in our own time, this is all just past. founder was only 25, and it was 30 years ago. I mean, and think of what it's done. So, but a colleague of mine for years at LMU, Kristen Hyder, who has a wonderful new book on the Catholic social thought and immigration ethics. It's terrific. Points to the role of the Catholic Health Organization on the issue of healthcare reform. What the bishops couldn't do, they could do. And then she has done careful study of a thing that actually the Jesuits from Mexico and California started, the so-called Kino Border Initiative. This is in Arizona, at the border. And what you're getting is you're trying to service these non-documented immigrants and paying attention to what happens before they even get across to our border. And she particularly pays a lot of attention on people who are paying attention to women. The sexual abuse of half or more of the women, that's the price they have to pay for the coyote to come here. Of course, the deaths of many of the people trying to cross, because the easy ways to cross are now all border patrols or whatever. So by making our borders safe, we have upped dramatically the number of non-documented immigrants who have died. I've had in my room for a bunch of years now. This goes back to a conference I went to in Tijuana, where we went to the, I don't know whether you've ever seen this, it's like the Berlin Wall. We went to that huge thing. And I was on the Mexican side, and somebody came on a donkey, a young man and a woman on a donkey. It was Christmas time. I think that's what they were talking about. And they asked to cross, and then they were told, no, you don't get it. But what was dramatic to me was there was a reading of all the people that year, so this would have been, I don't know, about 8 years ago, all the people that year who had died, and they all had crosses. There were hundreds of them. And many of the crosses simply said anonymous, but some had names. And I kept in my room a cross with somebody's name to remind me of this issue. So again, this movement is about not just an abstract issue of justice, but it's also connected to real people and social movements on the ground, and has been effective in raising issues of health and particularly the violence against women, both on the way and then also in our own country, believe it or not, when they get put into these detention facilities. And again, you get that from a social movement, and particularly, maybe you don't know whether male celibates writing from the Vatican would be that interested in the woman's issue. Who knows? But they are. Other presentations, now, I mentioned CAFA. I can't stress enough what an important, influential group this is. This is Great Britain. And this is their Catholic charities, National Catholic Charities. And they also have dealt with, if only Americans would learn this, but you can't get them to do this. They're dealing with illegal immigrants in England. Oh, I thought we're the only ones who have them. I once was asked by a reporter from the LA Times about the non-documented immigrants in the United States. I said, do me a favor. And actually, the woman was a Hispanic reporter. Would you do me a favor? I've never seen it. Would you point out that this is not just an American problem? In Korea, there are all these non-documented immigrants. In Thailand, most of the people who died when they had that huge tsunami were from Burma, Myanmar. They were illegal immigrants. In Taiwan, there are lots of illegal immigrants. So it's in Germany and in Spain, etc. And so one has to raise the larger social issues about what is the impact of international economic realities on doing this. For example, I used to go, again, this is on this thing of immigration, I used to go every week for 10 years point, we were getting, so I did it for 10 years, we were getting people from a part of Mexico I never, they never came there before. Then what also became clear to me was after NAFTA, so the North American Free Trade Act, with our subsidized agriculture, somebody who had 250 acres in Mexico, who before could live on that growing corn, couldn't even sell it because it wasn't subsidized. And so they all went out. I mean, so it isn't just, so CAFOD is trying to deal about strangers into citizens, and they've had 250,000 volunteers working with that Catholic organization to work for a conditional way to earn citizenship. Now, this is an issue in our own country, but it does show how a social movement has been effective. There's another CAFOD project on community organizing, and again, here in the United States, we have church-based community organizing groups, which were all started or taken over, in Alinsky's case, taken over very soon by Catholics who were inspired by Catholic social teaching, but again, not just as an abstract thing, but to organize people, to have specific advocacy and demands. Let us get more police stations in our neighborhood. Let us get the prostitutes off the street, whatever it would be. And so the same sort of thing was happening in England. From Australia, there was a group that was talking about Catholic social movements working for Aborigine rights to land and other rights. As you know, it was only in 1980, I think it was, Justice Brennan, the Catholic Chief Justice, decided for the first time that Australian Aborigines had some land rights, because of course it was collectively owned, and so they didn't have charters to show, etc. From the Philippines, there was an example about a group called Couples for Christ, which started as, like what you'd expect, couples, helping marriage and whatever. But they moved to social engagement, and there was a kind of split, because there were those who, so some of this can be complex. So there were those who didn't want social engagement. They just wanted engagement, encounters leading to good marriages, but not social engagement. From Latin America, we heard that the option for the poor is now accepted by all, even conservatives. Not liberation theology, but the option for the poor. And from Nigeria, we got some examples about you can't always too strongly separate charity and justice. When the church is the only force for justice, as in the Congo, what do you do? My point of this is simply to say that these social movements that you may have studied about in order to understand what led to Rerum Novarum and what were these working class pilgrims going to Rome, it isn't only something that happened in 1890. They're still happening around the world. And they are carriers of this tradition. So some dilemmas or conflicts about Catholic social teaching. This is from Pope Paul VI, Octogesimo Adani, that's Latin, that says, the 80th year is coming, the 80th year of Rerum Novarum. This is a very important document, where he says, it's up to the Christian communities. He didn't say it's up to the Vatican, it's up to the Pope, it's up to the bishops. It's up to the Christian communities to analyze, that should be with objectivity, then you better get some social science skills to do that, and be a dialogue with it, the situation which is proper to their own country. Some things maybe cry out to heaven in one country, but you don't want to simply universalize it. Remember my example of, in 1905, all Catholics should belong only to Catholic labor unions. Well, the British said, the Australians said, and the Americans said, don't apply here. That situation isn't proper to us. It's maybe proper to you in Belgium and Holland. To shed on it the light of the Gospel's unalterable words, and for action from the social teaching of the Church. It's up to these Christian communities, with the help of the Holy Spirit, and in dialogue with other Christian brethren and men of goodwill, to discern the options and commitments which are called for in order to bring about the social, political, and economic changes seen in many cases to be urgently needed. Now, this is the 50th anniversary of Vatican II. It's one of the central documents of Vatican II, and the one most concerned with Catholic social teaching, and the most important of all of them, was the Church in the Modern World, which had its own, which took on this theme, really, see Judge Act, read the Signs of the Times. That's built into that document. But it also said that we have to collaborate with all men and women of goodwill for issues of the common good and justice. And if we don't, we will be ineffective, and we will be undermining the possibility of effectiveness for others. I'll come back to that. To discern the options and commitments which are called for in order to bring about the social, political, and economic changes seen in many cases to be urgently needed. Now, there's recently been a kind of pullback in parts of the church from this notion of cooperation. You know, well, Doctors Without Borders seems to hold something different than the official teaching of the Church in contraception. And so there's been some concern. Does Caritas International work with Doctors Without Borders? In my study of Jesuit refugee service, they wouldn't work without Doctors Without Borders, without that kind of partnership. So if you want to be pure and you will only deal with those who are like you, hooray, that's not a Catholic position. It's called sectarianism, and it's deeply against the whole tradition of Catholic social thought. So we have to be really strong on this and have the movements to do it. So at Vatican II, there is an emphasis on conscience, but we're now getting a new kind of thing which contrasts with the new emphasis on what is called Christian conscience, as if we know in advance what the answer of conscience will always be. And on many issues, there's not a specific Christian conscience. An emphasis on justice as well as charity versus Caritas and Veritate, which in many ways is a wonderful encyclical, and Dan Finn has a terrific book that he edited commenting on it. But it seems to relegate justice issues to the state and charity to the church. But there are places, and have been in the past, I mean, think of Chile during the dictatorship, where the only, and also Coleman, where the only voice that was available on justice issues, the only voice that was not sent to jail and not totally, collapsed was that of the church. And also, there's been some downplaying of ecumenism or cooperation with all men and women of goodwill. So, and we need to look at both the ideal and what is feasible and possible. But, I think when we look at Catholic social teaching, we have to be aware of what's happening that might undermine it. Now, how do we go on from here? Well, how do we put together at the institutional and parish levels Catholic social service? We accompany and learn from suffering. So we're not speaking outside of other people's experience. We've been there with them. Okay. And how do we get Catholic solidarity with the needy, doing together what we cannot do alone? And how do we move to Catholic social advocacy? And this is a place where the church, the official church, might shrink back. And if I was a bishop, I might be cautious about having the collective bishops. If I was a bishop, I probably wouldn't last very long, and I might speak out myself. But I might be cautious about the collective bishops speaking too strongly in terms of advocacy. But without it, we do not really move beyond charity to justice. And it's another argument about the importance of Catholic social movements for the viability of Catholic social teaching. We need to also go into the marketplace of ideas. Now there too is Leuven, that's the market. You can see filled with people drinking beer. But we also learned from secular movements. Again, this was true in the Doctrine of the Church in the Modern World, which is a central document in Catholic social teaching, was that the church is a teaching church, but it also learns. After all, you can't say, as the church always taught, we believe in religious liberty for everybody. No, it taught that in Vatican II. But it wasn't teaching that in the 19th century. It didn't teach that when Hus was in Czechoslovakia. But it learned something. It learned from the secular Enlightenment to some extent. And it didn't necessarily baptize the secular Enlightenment in its fullness. It gave a Catholic account of it. But it had learned from secular movements, and it may have something to add to them. On human rights, on ecology, now perhaps from the new ideas about well-being. Again, there are interesting secular people, I think, of Montresson and Martha Nussbaum, who have a whole kind of theory of what human flourishing is about. And after all, much of what Catholic social teaching is about social and human flourishing, human dignity, etc. So we need to have that dialogue strongly. And that pretty much was my lecture. So I'm open now to questions. Is that abrupt? So questions, comments, complaints? Yes.
Well, various things were going through my head as you were speaking, and one of them was, does the so a lot of Catholic social teaching is kind of from the top down, comes through the encyclicals of popes,
Right.
And you're saying that these things are influenced by the movements,
Yes.
but it's as though the movements come first.
They tend to.
One of the questions in my mind is, does official Catholic social teaching ever really catch up with the movements?
Sometimes they don't, and that's an important question. In the paper I wrote, one of the respondents to my paper said, well, you know, I mean, what I argued is there's still a role for this official kind of baptizing and blessing what it learned from the movements, and you know. But she said, well, what happens when they, as in the liberation theology debates or whatever, when they don't hear it? Well, then I think we have to also have at least, just as I said, sociologically, Catholic social teaching needs a model of conflict as something that is not always bad, but could be good. I think we need the same thing in the church. Sometimes we need to, because actually, if you look, okay, in saying that the encyclicals finally blessed what started in the Catholic social movements, if you look at that history carefully, it wasn't like on day one in 1870 or 1865, the Pope in Rome was blessing these people who were coming, saying, you've got to do something about labor, you've got to do something about labor. Eventually it blessed it, but it didn't always. So there's conflict. But thank you. That's a good question. Yes?
Where does solidarity fit into your analysis?
Okay, yes. Well, solidarity is a moral virtue.
No, I'm talking about the Polish
Oh, the Polish solidarity, okay. Well,
movement solidarity.
oh, okay, yeah, because there's also, Catholic social thought talks about solidarity, our bondedness with people. Well, solidarity, how does it fit in? Well, it was a movement of Catholic labor union people. John Paul II, even though he didn't start that. He blessed it, but he didn't start that. So it came from below. But people who were aware of this tradition about justice and Catholic tradition of participation and workers' rights, etc. Does that get it? What you're asking about? I'm not a detailed historian of the solidarity movement itself. So.
Well, I'm really concerned that we seem to have a bad case of amnesia about what happened in Poland in the 1980s. either.
No, but what's the lesson you think we should learn?
I observed
Yeah.
that it was indeed a lay-initiated movement that probably would not have succeeded had it not been supported by the hierarchy.
That's right.
And it probably would not have succeeded if the Cardinals had not taken the chance of electing Ortega as Pope. But it's, of all the Catholic social movements I know about, it's surely had the greatest impact.
It certainly did. It had an extraordinary impact. Yes.
Now, and what can we learn from that? That's my question.
Well, it goes back somewhat to the question of what happens when the hierarchy doesn't necessarily initiate, but what happens if they don't listen? Then they wouldn't, you're probably right. If the bishops had opposed it, it might not have gone anyplace. So it goes back to the tension between the social movements and official church recognition that they are themselves learning the signs of the times from the social movement. So, you had a question? But thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if this will necessarily get to a question and stuff, but I just noticed in your lecture a kind of tension between, on the one hand, a sort of pull toward wanting to kind of oppose lay movements and the institutional church. And on the other, the sort of symbiotic kind of interdependence between the two. And, right. So where you point to a lot of advantages of these lay social movements that.
And network and can, can focus on one issue and follow it and study it and can advocate.
Right, so they have the ability to network and do all these things and maybe get places that the magisterium as such can't necessarily get into.
Right.
And how those movements and the sort of lobbying from that has influenced the official teaching. And then that official teaching, it seems to me, in turn, really gives
Universalized.
well, I was going to say it gives the causes that those movements are working for some really serious authoritative weight.
Yes. And so I think it's important. I mean, I think the recognition by the magisterium of what the movements have started is important for that reason.
Right. So I just wanted to I guess push back a little on that I was sensing a bit of an undertone of suspicion of the institutional church in general.
No.
And I think if we make it a sort of good guys and bad guys,
Well, thank you. I hear what you're saying.
when there is
Theologically, the hierarchy is not the official church. Read the document on the church. The hierarchy, the laity, so the hierarchy is not the only official church, and it's not the only teacher in the church. Read the
I didn't
document.
say it was.
Okay, right.
find any commonalities in the types of environments that are incubators for Catholic social movements, on the one hand? And secondly, how do Catholic social movements not become co-opted by political ideology?
Yeah, that's important. Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose when there are already logical connections between Catholics, maybe the country is Catholic or whatever, and subgroups that are concerned about issues of justice or whatever, that's an incubator. But the thing about not being co-opted is very important, and that's why I would go back, and it didn't make me expressive enough, of the importance of connecting these movements. Some have been co-opted. So in history we can show that. There was the young Christian students in part of Latin America in the 60s were co-opted. They were co-opted, and they lost their kind of habit. Well, I think this is why, see, judge, act. Okay. That judges in the light of the gospel values. That's always a component. So it's not just a sociological. And secondly, the thing I was saying about putting together spirituality and liturgy with the social movement, it keeps the Catholic identity correct. But yeah, there's no guarantee that such a movement. After all, this isn't a totally new thing. Remember, I talked about different types. The church had to discern the Franciscans. And again, the first act wasn't to say, let's bless them. It's the one. Ignatius was, I can say this because it was the Benedictines, it was the Dominicans, but Ignatius was arrested by the Dominican Inquisition. So again, there was a testing. So it's not like it's a brand new thing, that kind of new movements that renew the church, and there is a testing. But the Catholic social teaching is not simply a doctrine about ideological understandings of justice. So it's got to be connected more deeply than that. So I thank you for that question. Yes, and then there. Yeah.
One of the things I found myself thinking about in terms of today's Catholic social movements is the barriers that exist, certainly within society, and I think also within the church, along the sort of theological and political spectrum. It seems to me that if I advertise, we're going to talk about Catholic social teaching, the liberals show up, conservatives don't see themselves welcome. And the liberals, and I self-identify as one, tend to talk and act in ways that don't welcome people who self-identify other than that.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about your sense of, is that really going on, and how can we overcome it if it is?
I think it's really going on. I think most of us who look around have that sense. As to your second question, I'm not sure. I wish I had more wisdom.
So
Do you have a suggestion?
I have two suggestions, and they're meant for the people in this room because I think there's something that they're available to us. I imagine that it would be really interesting to convene a conversation around what it means to wage peace from the personal to the global, and be sure that we're inviting the Pax Christi and the respect life people to our table.
Yes.
I think it'd be really interesting to mobilize around issues of economic justice locally and ask the Catholic worker people and the economic development people to come together and talk about, what would Jesus do about economic development? And I think that would stretch us, but I think that's a place worth exploring.
There were two attempts in the 1980s in the United States by the American bishops to do something like that. There were these public hearings where Michael Novak on the one hand and Cesar Chavez on the other. And I remember when their economy pastor came out, I was at a conference at Gonzaga University, and James Tobin was there, the Nobel laureate for economics, despite the Irish sounding name, not at all a Catholic. But I always remember him saying the following, that the bishops got the economics right because they were the only ones in the United States talking And it
ask,
goes back to the ideological misuse. There's less danger of it, if what we suggest happens. Yeah.
I was going to ask about the bishops in the 1980s. Were there social movements behind that very fertile period of pastorals on?
Well, there certainly was. One other time when I got arrested was, there were movements. Remember?
And were they?
About nuclear weapons for the bishop's document on war and peace, which probably had more impact than the economy one did. There were movements.
And the bishops were listening.
Yeah.
Okay, and then my next.
And in fact, there was a hearing. Again, this was the nuclear weapons thing. There was a hearing of the GTU, and John Quinn came, and he was president of the bishops' conference, and he was listening. But there was, the Pax Christi group was doing lobbying to make sure these issues got raised, and so.
The next part of my question is then what happened in the 90s with the American Catholic bishops in relationship to social movements and Catholic social teaching?
I'm not sure I give you the definitive answer to that, but something seems to have happened.
Yes.
There's nobody of the stature of Bernadine who can speak like he could. And again, across ideological borders, we don't have that. So I don't know what happened. They pointed different kinds of issues. I don't know who they listened to or who they invited to talk to them. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that.
Well, one of the memories I have is that the next pastoral issue that they tackled
Oh, yeah, it was the women's.
was the women's issue, and the Vatican stepped in. And so it would, my reflection on that would be, we started to look internally. It was fine to be prophetic about the culture,
Right.
but to do sort of self-reflection
Right.
was scarier.
Well, the women's issue was both, after all, the women's issue is not only an issue
Right.
in
Right.
Catholicism, but yes, and that was, as you know, they were faced with publishing something that would do harm or not publishing at all, so they decided wisely the latter. But there was often Roman and other complaints about the process of this listening and dialogue, because, they claimed it was undermining the authoritative role of bishops. I don't see that it was.
I was just going to say that Archbishop Weakland, who chaired the economics committee, was called to Rome, and the press thought he was called to Rome to be criticized for being too liberal, too conservative. In fact, they complained that it looked like the bishops didn't know what to teach until they listened to the laity,
Right.
and this was undermined the bishops.
Right.
So Rome was clearly sending like a message, this is not a good process, even though more people read these documents than any other documents ever written by the U.S. bishops.
Well, and moreover, it's Lent. So one of the things about most of these documents is, go read one and do it at your penance. It's 100 pages and whatever. The Canadians have they tend to be 10 pages. They tend to have catechetic people help them write them. They tend always to end with, what can I do? Now, there are vices to that. The bishop's letters also touch policy people, and But so what was interesting, most people didn't read those letters. They read about them in the New York Times and heard about them on CBS. Most Catholics didn't read those letters.
How important is the concept of a way of life in relation to Catholic social movements? Taking the abstract, the ideal, and localizing it, you find a connection with, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there a deep sense of embodiment with a way of life that people choose to live into in relation to their.
Right. I think the categories of different kinds of movement And some of those green, well, of course, green sisters are already committed, in terms of vows to green sisters. But some of their centers are closer to being way of life centers.
John, if you think of all the movements you've talked about tonight, what is your own view of one or two that you think are most promising for the future of the church at the moment?
Well, I'm biased on Pax Christi. It's international. It too, it depends where you are. We may not know of conflict resolution issues that they've been engaged in Africa and elsewhere. Beyond, their former 25 years or whatever, was it, presider, there's an official bishop thing, but he was the guy who ran it, the executive secretary, is trying to write some of that up. And while we're not going to easily remove war of all sorts from theory, conflict resolution is a very important issue in terms of justice. Finding mediations of things other than the violence, and violence even short of war, that is often used for conflict mediation. And they do have a long history. They have their own inner conflicts, as you know, because Pax Christi was founded after World War II between the French and Germans, and it was not in principle against just war theory, but in some branches, like the United States, almost all of them are pacifists, so you've got the argument there. That won't go away. But I do think they have a deeply embedded issue of spirituality in them. I think that you asked for several. What? No, but you know this stuff as well as I do. Is there any other that you would have?
Well, I find Santa Egidio really...
It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It's truly extraordinary. It's not as big, so where it's, because it's located, and maybe that's the other side of this your question about way of life versus something that's has prayer and whatever, but is more organizational. The flexibility of extension of the organizational thing has a certain virtue that the way of life doesn't have. But the way of life has the intensity and the,